Dueling speeches, dueling world visions. Ahead of Friday's first anniversary of Moscow's bid to seize Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin accused West, bent, he says, on destroying Russia, of holding Ukraine hostage. While over in Warsaw, Joe Biden seemed energized by his surprise Monday visit to Kyiv as he hailed the West's solidarity. Biden back in the same setting where last year the U.S. president quipped of his Russian counterpart, quote, "For God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power." Now, at the time, the White House rolled back those remarks. But was that, and is that, in fact, the plan? As for Putin, what are his options? He's still not calling it a war, but a fresh wave of mobilization is expected, perhaps. Will he ease up or double down? He told the Russian parliament of Moscow's suspension of its last remaining nuclear treaty with the United States. More bluster or the ominous prelude to a much darker escalation? Either way, no sign of peace breaking out anytime soon. How do ordinary Ukrainians navigate this anniversary, particularly near the battlefront lines? As the hard times are still to come. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the superpower showdown between Biden and Putin. With us, he's former French ambassador to Russia, Claude Blanche-Maison. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
We also welcome Anastasia Shapochkina, president of the Eastern Circles think tank. How are you?
Thank you.
Anton Kozlov, director of the International Center for the Study of Eurasia. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And from Vilnius, political analyst Alexandra Filipenko. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. So Biden in Kyiv, Biden in Warsaw, and in between, what we heard from Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Again, no talk of a new mass mobilization during his State of the Nation address. But 1 year on, there's no going back either. Cami Knight has more.
Standing between 8 Russian flags, Vladimir Putin delivered his highly anticipated speech to Russian lawmakers and elites. A recurring theme throughout his address, the war in Ukraine, and his vision that the West is to blame.
The responsibility for fueling the Ukrainian conflict, for its escalation, for the number of victims, lies entirely with Western elites and, of course, with the current Kiev regime.
The room is filled with generals, ministers, a grave expression on their faces. The Russian president asked that they rise for a minute of silence in memory of fallen soldiers, broadcast for all the country to see. To support their families, as well as veterans, Vladimir Putin announced a dedicated state fund. The message is clear: Russia will press on with the fight, whatever the cost.
Western elites are not hiding their goal to inflict, as they say, and I quote, a strategic defeat on Russia. But they also have to realize that it's impossible to defeat Russia on the battlefield.
The head of the Kremlin also presented himself as the defender of Christian values in the face of what he called a perverted West. According to Putin, Western sanctions imposed on Russia have had no impact, as he hinted at ties with Asia. It was a highly anticipated speech and came just a day after US President Joe Biden's surprise but symbolic visit to Kyiv. His visit to Poland today, another sign of his commitment to European security.
Let me begin with you, Anton Kozlov. This is an annual ritual, this speech before the Duma, targeted at a domestic audience. Highly anticipated, said Cami Knight in that report. Did the Russian people get what they wanted out of it?
Well, that's a very good question. I think he sounded to me, I listened to his speech for 2 hours direct. He sounded to me like a motivational speaker, basically. It was not at all what some commentators expected. I mean, I didn't expect much of anything because he does it every year for the past, 23 years now. No, I think it could have been much worse than what we had. The only sort of kind of...
What do you mean by could have been much worse?
Well, he could have declared that, instead of what they call a military operation, they could declare war on Ukraine. in those legal terms. He could announce a new wave of mobilization.
Which is what declaring war would have
Yeah,
signified.
it would be a very different story, but he didn't. And in fact, he's been urged to do that for quite a while now by all those commentators who demand that he put more effort into fighting Ukraine, going all the way to Kiev, chasing Ukrainians all the way to the Polish border. I mean, I've heard all those stories, and if you follow the Russian media, there are plenty of those stories. But he didn't do it because, frankly, I don't think he's in a position to do that. He doesn't have, despite what some even Western commentators say, he doesn't have enough resources for that.
Did Claude Blanche-Maison, did he deliver what you expected in that speech?
Well, it was a rather well-balanced speech, I would say, in front of a selected audience of the regime elite, but of course directed to the Russians first, to the Russian population, but also to the outside world, meaning, first of all, the enemy meaning
The perverted West.
Western people, yes, perverted West, but also the other one, the rest of the world, because he wants to keep the rest of the world, not criticize him too much, in fact, and there are many issues coming in the UN, for instance, and he wants them to keep quiet. People like India, people like Asia.
So it wasn't
Africa.
fire and brimstone.
Well, I think he had very harsh word against the West, of course, and he said everything has been organized by the West. He's just defending Russia. He said also that this war. He mentioned the word war once in the speech, and he said that it was a kind of existential threat for Russia, which is a very, very, very strong word, because existential threat meaning that it could justify the use of nuclear power.
Alexandra Filipenko, you heard Anton Kozlov there talking about what was not said. What's highest on your mind? What he said or what he didn't say?
Well, I think what the importance of the speech, and of course, as I would absolutely agree that it's directed not only at Russians, but also to the West, at the West. But what I saw, if you only leave the essence of what has been said, it turns out that the main outcome is a sharp increase of the minimum wage. This is just a blunt attempt to buy loyalty, a blunt attempt to buy people's loyalty. It's appeasement of the people, of Russian people.
And by the way, it seems to be, Alexandra, it seems to be working if you believe polling institutes. I mean, his popularity is riding high. Support for the war is riding high.
Yes, and he's only saying what people want to hear. He's unwilling to associate himself with getting tough on anyone, or even on the enemies. And what Anton absolutely correctly said, he doesn't say that we are going to Kiev, we will now get the whole Ukraine. That's what Russian propaganda is saying. And he let the deputies and the propaganda promise the confiscation of property for everyone who left and the enemies of the state, and the return of death penalty. But the president, on the contrary, according to the speech, is so kind-hearted. He is so nice. And he even in his speech, he said that he doesn't want to resemble the Kiev regime and the Western elites who are engaged in witch hunts. So he tries to appease the people. And yes, it works. For now, it works.
Vladimir Putin's chances, though, of a major victory in time for Friday's first anniversary are fading fast. The front line is barely budged since the Russian paramilitaries of Wagner last month spearheaded the capture of the salt mining town of Soledar, that's near Bakhmut. Wagner's boss lashing out at the brass in the suits for the second time inside of a week. Yevgeny Prigozhin speaking on his Telegram channel.
The Chief of the General Staff and the Minister of Defense are issuing order after order forbidding the delivery of ammunition to Wagner to help it with air transport. Information just came in saying that they cut off requests to issue sapper shovels, so they can't dig in.
Anastasia Shapochkina, What's going on? Is there a problem inside of the Kremlin? I mean, this is coming out the day of Vladimir Putin's speech, or is this all carefully crafted and stage managed?
No, what we've observed, of course, Prigozhin's this whole dance, Prigozhin versus the Ministry of Defense over the last few weeks, and especially or since the new offensive of the Russians in Ukraine, we have seen that what the Russian analysts on the Russian elites conclude is that Putin has given more resources to the army. Prigozhin failed in the first offensive to show results, to give concrete results. And now they are supposed to work together. But since the army versus the different private military companies hate each other, so the resources are rather being contested. And of course, there's a kind of an internal infighting zone, which in the Russian history of war.
So the infighting is genuine.
Is genuine, and it's not today that it started. But just to come back to the speech, I'd like also to add that, however, what Putin's speech is showing, no matter the infighting, no matter that all of the mistakes, that what he's saying is the war will be long. The war will go on as long, maybe, as Putin is in power. Mm-hmm. That he's ready to dedicate all of the economic resources of Russia toward the war, all of the population resources. Everything, the whole speech is just everything that before used to be foreign policy, internal policy, economics, and social. Now it is entirely dedicated toward the war, and it's a total Soviet speak. We are back to treason everywhere at home. We are back to enemies and imperialist powers abroad. It's as if Putin's speechwriters took Pravda of the years 1950, cut out literally sentences, and plugged them into the speech. And people in the audience, just when you're talking about polling in Russia now, I'm wondering, how do we know what is that polling worse? Since polling means either calling people on the phone or stopping them on the street and asking them questions. And then how many people in the audience do not understand that what they're hearing is propaganda? Because either you have the elites who are literally in the audience sitting there, and they know exactly what they've lost. Putin names it in his speech. He says, no more yachts. You made a mistake buying your real estate in the West. And now you see it because they confiscated. People literally know what they've lost. They've lost their yachts, they've lost their mansions, etc. in the West. And they've lost the right to go to Courchevel for vacation. Now they have to go to vacation to Kamchatka. Difference. But the people who are, the audience...
How's the snow in Kamchatka?
Exactly. We have to ask the people in the audience on TV, who watch this on TV, for example, or on YouTube, right? Do they really believe the propaganda? We have to ask this question of ourselves, because they see the price they are paying. Also, because with every foreign investor withdrawing, you have local unemployment created, and of course you have coffins and body bags.
Alexandra Filipenko, there was this line in the speech, I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, where Putin talks about a Western plot to try to hoodwink younger people on social media. Is there a generation gap in Russia right now?
Yes, absolutely. There is a huge generation gap because young people watch YouTube, and this is the only source of information that is still open in Russia. And soon, most probably, YouTube is going to be blocked because Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, everything is blocked in Russia. So elderly people, I don't think that it's not that I think they really don't use VPN that much, and they do not go around those blocks. So they don't have that much information. And most people over 50 watch only Russian state television, and the only state television is propaganda. And propaganda in Russia works really, really well. And so there is a generational gap. Those people who want to be on TikTok, that want to use VPN and still be on Instagram or Facebook or use Twitter, this is the younger generation, and they can get some other kinds of information. They can get, for example, they can watch France 24 right now, for example, and get the information. But the elderly people of the older generation, they do not watch it, and they do not use YouTube that much. So this is a big problem right now. But I really want to add something to what Anastasia said. When I was listening to the speech, when Putin was talking about culture, I vividly remembered the speech of 1946. It was redacted by Stalin, and it's exactly those words. And I was even thinking, oh my God, will they put quote marks?
Plagiarism.
Because you can just Plagiarism, absolutely. And the other thing to what Anastasia said, I would just like to add, why Russia sending a signal that Russia is ready to wage a long war is Putin said that combatants and people in the army will now be given vacations for 2 weeks every 6 months. And this is clearly, I think, addressed to the West, because Moscow is saying that don't count on us to be exhausted. We're going to fight a long fight. We're going to fight a long war. So, sorry, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, it's going to be a long war. Claude Blanche-Maison,
I agree with that.
the selling point of all these weapons that the West is pledging to Ukraine is to shorten the war.
I agree with this assessment that the war is becoming part of the regime, and the state has to be aligned with this situation, which is war part of the regime. And as far as the generation gap, of course, I mean, young people are informed by all sort of means, and Putin refusing to close the country. I mean, everybody in the city has relatives or friends abroad, and they are linked by telephone or by any kind of means of information. So the information is coming in from the outside, because Putin refused absolutely the advice given by people in the Kremlin to close the country. He said no, because those who want to go away, they are opponent anyway. So I prefer them to be away. And if part of the elite of the country, he doesn't care about it, because he doesn't care, in fact, about future of the Russian economy. So it's a pity for that, because the economy will be going down with less innovation, and of course people getting the average people getting older. So, but I think he doesn't care about that, and he's going for a long time war, part of the regime, maybe until he left the power.
And certainly getting that message across, as you say, that Russia's ready for the long haul, for a wartime economy. Over in Warsaw, Joe Biden, with a definite spring in his step, as he addressed an enthusiastic crowd at the Royal Castle, hailing Polish and NATO solidarity, and issuing a direct appeal to the Russian people.
This war was never a necessity. It's a tragedy. President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice. He could end the war with a word. It's simple. If Russia stopped invading Ukraine, it would end the war. If Ukraine stopped defending itself against Russia, it would be the end of Ukraine. That's why together we're making sure Ukraine can defend itself.
Powerful words, Anastasia Shapochkina. But of course, you heard Alexandra say that that's only for the VPN crowd.
No, I don't think the words by President Biden were directed toward the Russians, because, again, even fewer Russians, we suppose, which tune into France 24 are going to tune into Biden's speech. But just to say that, rather, these are the words directed to Putin himself, to say that we are going to be here. America is not going to be just going back and sitting like on Trump on the couch observing, but rather we are going to be active. We are going to give Ukraine the support it needs. And the fact that Biden is coming to Poland right after the U.S. in the last year has made out of Poland the center of its military presence in Europe, and after it's no longer Germany, we can almost say this, it has brought thousands of military personnel, the U.S. military personnel, into Poland, has covered Poland with Patriot defense systems, has made out of Poland the hub of weapons and other types of aid toward Ukraine. This is also a strong signal to NATO partners, to other European partners, to China, after all, as well, to Putin himself, that the U.S. is there, they're close, and they are going to stand by Ukraine. This is the important signal to Putin himself. And the direct answer to Putin's speech, where he says the war was a necessity, we went there to protect our territory, because they consider Ukraine their own territory. Well, Biden's saying there is no such necessity of war at all. So just a total different stance, and especially the message, of course, which we can consider as the first move of the toward the presidential campaign. He launched it.
For his U.S. presidential re-election campaign.
Yes,
definitely. And Joe Biden, who in that speech was, it almost felt like a victory lap. Vladimir Putin's been to the Kerch Strait Bridge, but Joe Biden can now claim bragging rights to being the first U.S. president since Abraham Lincoln to visit a war zone where Washington didn't control the skies. These photos aboard that night train from Poland to Kyiv, taken by the Associated Press photographer Evan Vucci. And we were waiting for some kind of a zinger line, kind of like when Reagan from Berlin said, tear down this wall. We didn't get one, but the zinger was that trip, Claude Blanche-Maison, to Kyiv.
I mean, the trip to Kiev is, of course, a great event and a great victory for Biden. He managed to do that despite the fact that people say, well, of course, he's not very young, he's old, and sometimes it's difficult for him, but he did it 10 years in the train, 10 hours in the train, and he stayed in 5 hours in Kiev, which is quite a long time, in difficult security conditions. He did it, and I think it's a big success. But the problem, coming back to the Polish attitude, is that Poland, maybe with the Baltic state, would like to go further than the US. They would like, in fact, to defeat Russia, and to defeat Russia to the point that after this defeat, Russia would not be anymore Russia. It would be a smaller state. And that is not acceptable for the US. That is not acceptable for the EU either. But you can hear many people in Poland and in the Baltic states saying that according to what they have suffered during history, they really want a defeat of Russia. So there is a sort of discrepancy about the real goal of this war. And that's why it is very worrying. I think after having heard those two speeches today, I'm really pessimistic about the future.
Alexander Filipenko, Joe Biden's going to be sitting down with NATO leaders on Wednesday in Warsaw. Is he going to have to curb their enthusiasm?
Oh, well, maybe, but it's very important that he's meeting the leaders of the Bucharest Nine, the group of Eastern European NATO allies that was created after Crimea was annexed in 2014. So there, they are going to be very excited about what is happening. The Bucharest Nine, I mean, exactly what you've been saying right now, that those Eastern European NATO allies, that they really want Russia to be defeated, and they really want to have Ukraine win this war. And meeting with them is, I think, also symbolic for President Biden. And there, he doesn't need to curb their enthusiasm. They are very enthusiastic, and they are very happy to see that the United States is helping and that Washington is there on the ground. U.S. don't have boots on the ground, but they have president on the ground. That's also extremely important and very symbolic. So, and also President Biden talked about this NATOization of Finland, how he called it, because he said that President Putin expected the Finlandization of NATO, meaning that Finland wasn't a member of NATO. But now Finland is becoming the NATO member, and this is all extremely symbolic, and everything is, it shows how United States and Europe are united. And I think this meeting is going to show even more unity between the EU and the US.
Anton Kozlov, we're talking about an 80-year-old man who doesn't always have a spring in his step, sometimes has trouble reading the prompter. But on the other hand, he's a veteran Cold Warrior. Has Biden surprised you in the past year?
Well, no, I think from the start he was bound on getting rid of Putin. I think that's his.
He wants to get rid of Putin.
He wants to get rid. Absolutely, I'm persuaded that Americans want to get rid of.
So when he made that line, when he said that line last year in Warsaw, the same place about, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power.
Yes, I think that's what he really believes, and I think in that sense he basically follows on the steps of Churchill, who refused to negotiate with Hitler at the beginning of World War II. And I think we should, it's a very good example for me at least, to understand that he considers Putin as someone who broke the deal, who violated all the existing treaties, institutional arrangements, and started a war in Europe. So he must go. And that would be the goal of the United States. At the same time, I think, at this point, when we talk about either Russian or Ukrainian victory, like Poland wants Ukraine and everybody, what does it mean? We don't really have any definition of what would victory in that case mean. I mean, would it be the fall of Putin? Okay, who will replace Putin? What are the groups that may take over? We don't know. We don't have anybody at this point in Moscow. Or on the other hand, Russian victory, what would that mean? Going to Kiev, pushing Ukrainian troops to Poland? I mean, we don't know. There is no clear understanding, and I don't think either well, Zelensky may have some ideas, but I'm not sure they're realistic. But Putin doesn't have any idea. That's clear. And nobody in his cabinet, except for those people on the fringe who want to go all the way to Kiev and to Berlin, they know what victory would mean. But fortunately, they're not in power.
And does Biden know what victory would mean?
Well, I think getting rid of Putin, that would be his sort of...
Do you agree that that's because remember when Biden said that last year, the same setting.
Same setting.
The White House then rolled it back. Oh well, it's not
That's
exactly.
what he meant, really.
Is this though, as Anton says, what he really thinks?
Just first to add, and then to answer to that, I would like to add why the importance of this this stance is. Sending a message to Putin that it's not a negotiating partner anymore is in itself extraordinarily offensive, because for Putin, the only negotiating party among all the NATO is the US. Biden saying, giving all of these signs means that he treats Russia again as an underling. And that's not the message that Putin had gotten just before the war in June 2021, when we saw those photo ops with Biden and Putin smiling.
In Geneva.
And then in Geneva, and then Nord Stream 2 was validated by the United States, allowed, so to say. That's now Biden is saying to Putin, you went too far. You are no longer at all considered by me as anywhere in near, I'm no longer in the Cold War, basically, mentality. He's getting out of the Cold War mentality. He sees and he understands what Russia means when it says, I'm suspending the participation in all of the arms controls. It means Russian hands are untied. The leader has said it. So they are now entirely
And are all
unpredictable.
NATO members singing from the same hymn sheet?
And Putin's speech, Putin is warning, particularly France and Great Britain, saying, be afraid. If you side with the United States, US nuclear power are going to be also targeted. But I would disagree with Anton on the vision of the victory, because I think Ukraine has a clear vision of the victory. They have outlined it many times. It's rolling back to the borders in 2013. So that would include...
Give us back Crimea.
Donbass, Lugansk, fully, the full two regions, and Crimea. For the West, I think, in numerous speeches by Western leaders, this has also been outlined. We can only deduct it, but we can see that the West is very afraid to give back the Crimea. They are afraid of Russia. And the Great Britain and France, especially numerous speeches by the leaders, especially President Macron, are absolutely responsive to Putin's threats in this way, because they are signaling all the time that they don't want crushing Russia, etc. And then Russia has signaled that by annexing the 4 regions where its primarily goal is. But where its final goal, there I completely agree with Anton. Nobody knows, and especially they themselves do not know, because would it be just those 4 regions? It's not about land. Russia is a huge country. It's about where would it go next, how far would it go, and how many resources does it have.
And does NATO sing from the same hymn sheet?
I don't think so.
Claude Blanche-Maison.
I think at this stage we should stick with the basic position to support Zelensky, and to support Zelensky saying he wants to recover all his territory, the original territory of Ukraine. I said at this stage, but the problem is that probably from a military point of view, and Max Millet, the chief of staff of the US forces, said it, from a purely military point of view, it will not be possible at short in a few months. And it will not be possible even with the present constraint. The present constraint being that the battle is only on the Ukraine territory, and we refrain the Ukrainians to use the armament we are giving to them to
attack inside Russian territory.
Yes, to shell the Russian territory. So it will only be possible, including getting rid of Putin, with the intervention of NATO, of the US, and therefore of the US. But the US don't want to do that. I mean, and they don't want to do that because they think they cannot do that because of the nuclear deterrence.
Is that what Emmanuel Macron meant when
Exactly.
in his speech, in his interview last weekend?
Exactly. I mean, some people say in Ukraine that nuclear deterrence is something which does not exist. After all, the Russians have put red lines to many times in the last month. Each time we were going on and on in increasing what we deliver to Ukrainian in new armaments and more sophisticated armaments. So we don't know if there is a red line, but probably there is a red line, which is the existential threat on Russia.
So speaking of red lines, Anton Kozlov, maybe you can answer this. Vladimir Putin gives the speech. In it, he says, we're suspending participation in the last nuclear non-proliferation treaty with the United States. And then a few hours later, the Kremlin says, yes, we're suspending participation, but we're going to continue to honor the commitments to the thresholds when it comes to those nuclear missiles. So are they rolling back what he said?
I think they're trying to kind of, or mitigate. But I think what he said, what is important that he said today, is that he, for some reason, talked about Russian nuclear arsenal. He said that Russian nuclear launch systems had been upgraded, 92% of them. Therefore, because we hear all the time in Russia and elsewhere that Russian nuclear arsenal had been completely outdated. It's rusted. It's nothing can fly. Well, he wanted, I guess, to make a point that it is not outdated. It can fly. It will fly if it has to. I think
we'd rather not go there.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to test that.
I think this issue of victory, particularly Ukrainian victory, it's a very kind of iffy thing because where will be that sort of, okay, they can get rid of the Russians, they can push them out of those territories, at the Kherson region and Zaporozhye. But Crimea, I mean, what will that give? I think it's going to be very problematic. I think it's not just because of the sort of Russian occupation. It's more complex than that. Frankly, the only way out of this quagmire is to negotiate, and I think Biden understands that. I think the final goal of Biden is to get rid of Putin because Putin, it's not just the war. I mean, Putin violated the existing rules many times over, well before the war started.
He's ready to negotiate with Russia, but not with Putin.
I think that's why China is going to sort of present their sort of peace plan. I don't think it's going to be acceptable. I think that's something that's, because the United States, I would assume, want China to be on their part.
Alexander Filipenko, we heard there was a long silence from Beijing after Russia announced that Xi Jinping would be going to Moscow. And then we hear this Tuesday that, yes, China's coming, quote, in the coming months. So it's not tomorrow morning.
No, absolutely not. Not tomorrow morning. And China is very cautious. And of course, NATO is increasingly concerned that China may be planning to provide lethal support to Russia's war. That's what Jens Stoltenberg said. And China knows this. And I think Anastasia said it at the beginning that this visit to Kiev is also a signal to China that maybe China should stay out of this sphere of influence. Maybe China shouldn't get into European war and things that are happening here in Europe. So this is also clearly a signal to China, of course, because the Chinese top diplomat is in Moscow right now. And of course, there are talks of some military support from China. And we know that China sells drones both to Ukraine and Russia. So Russia is very interested in this Chinese Chinese military support. And this clear signal of that China shouldn't better be involved in what's happening in Europe, I think it's been heard in Beijing, and that is why there is no clear date and nothing clearly has been said and nothing came out as of now from the visit of the Chinese top diplomat to Moscow.
All right, so keeping this war in Europe, and it is war in Europe. Claude Blanche-Maison mentioning there.
I think Wang Li was in Paris a few days ago. The former foreign minister of China. He has been promoted to be the foreign minister of the party, which is much better than being simply the foreign minister. He was also in Munich a few days ago. And I don't know what he said in Paris. He has a meeting with the president and with Madame Colonna. I don't
foreign
know
minister.
what, the foreign ministry. There is just some kind of communique coming from the meeting with Madame Colonna, and the communique is referring to integrity of territories, of national territory, which is very interesting.
Because it sounds like China is on the side of the West against Russia.
On this issue of territorial integrity, yes, because they don't have any problem with Taiwan, because Taiwan is part of China for them.
Right.
So there is no problem. Territorial integrity is a great thing. So probably Wang Li is trying to do something around that, and maybe, I don't know what they are doing today in Moscow, but maybe, I mean, there is some idea that he could propose something implying the Security Council of the United Nations, not on the Ukraine issue, but on the territorial integrity as a basis of international order. And on that, it is possible to have an agreement in the Security Council, provided China convince Russia to abstain. If there is no provision on Ukraine, they could vote for it. And from that, something could be put on tracks, a kind of conference on what we do. Can we achieve some kind of truce, some kind of ceasefire? Can we decide that some part of the Ukraine territory are put under UN jurisdiction until there are votes controlled by the UN, until there is a decision? That's probably the only way to reconcile the two positions, position of Ukraine and position of Russia.
All right, of course, we're not there yet. And as you were saying earlier, Claude Blanche-Maison, it's going to be a hard slog ahead for both sides. In territory recaptured by Ukraine, payback comes in the form of constant shelling. Case in point, the southern city of Kherson, where Russia is accused of killing 6 civilians this Tuesday in the shelling of a market and a bus stop. In the flashpoint eastern city of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian military holding the line, but the shelling keeps coming, and so do the Russian soldiers acting as cannon fodder.
You see, they attack us in large numbers, 20 to 30 people at a time. The situation is difficult. They attack us 5 or 6 times a day from different sides. They are paramilitary, they have experience, but they have not entered Bakhmut itself. They are on the outskirts.
Anastasia Shapochkina, there was the jubilation of having Joe Biden in Kyiv, but when you speak to friends and relatives back in Ukraine, what's their mindset right now when you see what's going on in Bakhmut?
Interestingly, there are two messages that come out. Interestingly, that there is no there is no weakness of spirit that we witness in the West, in the eyes of the Western leaders. Every time we hear President Macron, we want to cry. There is no such a weakness of spirit when we talk to the people who work for the presidential administration, for the government, and just at any level, really. And also the civil society, just people who literally live and have lived for months now, right, with very patchy internet and electricity and heating systems, and sometimes days, for days without them. Really, no hesitation, no change of discourse. And these are people who have friends, who have relatives on the front, people who had a lot of the civil society organizations. They have often their husbands on the front, their children at home, absolutely disastrous conditions. But just to say that the more the Ukrainians fight, that surprises me, the less they're afraid of the Russians. And then on the other hand, of course, people from the front, and what people are observing is exactly what we just covered right now in the video, is there are waves and waves and waves of Russians being sent. And that really really is shocking to them, that there is such a waste of human life, but also that there is no end to the waves. And this, of course, it creates a lot of pressure, because you need a lot of ammunition to meet them.
You heard Anton Kozlov, Alexander Filipenko earlier in the conversation talking about how we're in a digital age where stuff like this gets out. Can you send cannon fodder? He's done it up to now, but can Russia's president continue to send people as cannon fodder?
Well, I think
politically speaking,
right now we had a lot of conscripts. I mean, a lot of contract soldiers and those who mobilized soldiers. They were coming from Siberia, the Far East, those minorities, ethnic minorities in Siberia. Like very few people from Moscow and St. Petersburg or Yekaterinburg go there. But it's going to change clearly, because once you exhaust all those resources, plus also convicts who were taken to the Wagner by the Wagner group. So it's going to change, of course. And then once people in Moscow will start getting
death sentences as invitations to be mobilized.
Notifications about their family members killed in the war. It's going. First of all, I do not believe that the majority of Russians support the war and support Putin. I think it's wrong. I think all those, like Putin today declared that the Russian economy just lost, I think, 2.1%. It's a lie. It's a clear lie, and everybody knows that. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe people who brought him this information kind of, pretend that this is true. But I mean, if you go to any Russian grocery store, you will see that the inflation there is more than 4%. That the economy is sort of getting smaller. That in fact, most of the cars sold on the market.
Yeah, but you heard Anastasia say how the Ukrainians are toughing it out. Russians can tough it out too.
Ukrainians know why they're fighting. Russians don't. Nobody in Russia can really, apart from this sort of bogus discourse about, Russia being attacked by NATO, nobody will give you a clear answer, except for people who say, yeah, well, this is the Nazis attacking us, all that kind of propaganda stuff. But very few people believe that, because, first of all, for the Russians, the Nazis are guys in black uniform, SS, 1941, 1945. Those are the real Nazis. Those guys in Ukraine today, they're kind of funny-looking Nazis. They don't really look like those real Nazis. And so I don't think a lot of people buy that stuff.
That's the whole question, I think, is that we don't really have a way to check, because we have to be skeptical about polls. We know that receiving people in body bags from your family members created two the opposite effects. It also creates an effect which is very logical, kind of biological almost, right, of wanting then to go after the killer, and the killer happens to be Ukrainian, so therefore creating radicalization of those people who had their people killed. But also you have massive amounts of people who just waking up to the political reality, something they've been vaccinated against for years.
Right.
With the death of the social contract, where do not stay out of politics, and then you're going to have your salary and you're going to have economic growth. Today, you stayed out of politics. We take everything out. Listen to the speech, right? We take everything out from you. We throw it all to the war. You are now going to be just the tool to conduct this war forever. And in exchange, we gonna triple the retirement pensions. Amazing.
Well, Alexander Filipenko, because we're out of time, I just want to ask you very briefly here. When Vladimir Putin makes that assertion that we're now in a wartime economy, he didn't use those exact words, but something to that effect. Does he know that he can maybe outlast the West? That we're the ones who will tire of it first?
That's what he's expecting. That is why he says that it's impossible to promise. He doesn't say it, but it means that it's impossible to promise the end of the war. It's essentially declared endless, because the West is always as they are. They're trying to attack us. NATO is trying to attack us, and it's impossible to agree with the West. But it's explained to citizens that it's in fact beneficial to them, that people will be paid, that children will be educated, that people who excelled at the front will be promoted in the army and the positions of power, and that it only seems to be getting better and better. The economy is just great. It's good as it is. It's not a war economy, because we don't need to militarize it. Everything is just fine. So that's his selling point. That's what he's trying to sell to the people. And for now, the people more or less, they believe what he's saying because they don't have any other sources of information. And everyone who tries to go out and say no to war, they are just being imprisoned, or they have to leave the country
or
somehow.
have to leave the country.
Like me, for example.
Alexandra Filipenko, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Vilnius. I want to thank Anton Kozlov, Anastasia Shapochkina, Ambassador Claude Blanche Maison. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.